what I seem to remember the most is that was seemed to be the era of horror film that brought us all of our standard tropes of one killer, not always explained why, going after a bunch of teenagers in the woods one at a time.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry, that's the wrong answer.
Let's set the scene, shall we? It's Saturday morning in May of 1980. You were up late the night before watching ABC's attempt of late-night sketch comedy with Fridays. Just waking up, you pour yourself a bowl of powdered donut cereal. The console TV turns on and you hear the sweet hum of static transition into the theme song to Strawberry Shortcake while sitting on the floor in your brown interior living room. Seriously, why the hell was everything so brown? Later that day, you call up your friends to see if they wanted to hang out at the arcade or roller skating rink, and then leave a post-it note on the fridge to let your parents know you'd be back later. And despite the claim made in Romy and Michelle's high school reunion, Romy did not invent adhesive glue.
Yeah, I did.
You did not?
Yeah, I did.
You did not?
Yeah, well, who did then?
A guy named Art Fry from the 3M Corp. We studied in business school.
While riding your bike to meet up with your friends, are you still holding firmly onto the dying days of disco, jamming out to Funky Town on your Walkman? Or were you an up-and-coming metalhead who was breaking the law, or mourning the death of Joy Division's Ian Curtis while listening to The Cure's 17 Seconds? After having the time of your life at Showbiz Pizza, the night rolls around and you and your friends want to check out the newest hot movie. However, this movie requires an adult to be in attendance. So you get a ticket to one movie and sneak into the newest R-rated horror film that everyone is talking about. These are all hypothetical situations that many can relate to, but as a kid, sneaking into R-rated movies was sometimes more thrilling than the movie themselves. Sure, sometimes you would get busted, but the act of getting away with it earned bragging rights at school that Monday. I remember a time when I would tell my friends about certain horror movies that I watched over the weekend, and seeing their jaws drop as I explained all the gory bits made this dorky kid feel like some sort of rebel at recess. And while I didn't sneak in to see the film on today's subject, I did happen to slip into one of its many sequels. That's right, kids. This is 1980, and on this episode, we are going to spend a long night at Camp Blood with Friday the 13th in our 80s horror memories. Like Drew Barrymore's character Casey Becker in Scream, I have always associated Friday the 13th with Jason Voorhees, even at a young age. I mean, can you blame me? For over 4 decades, yes, that's right, 4 decades, the iconic machete-wielding mama's boy has been the face of the franchise.
You could put anybody in that role. That's why Bond is interchangeable. It's the stunts. But horror icons from the 80s, it's about the horror icon. You want to see that character doing what they do in either a new environment or in a new way, but you want to see them.
And in similar fashion to James Bond, we all have our favorite Jasons. Whether it's the goalie masked killer hellbent on revenge from 3 and 4, the brutal zombified pissed off version, Uber Jason from space, fake Jason, or even the simplistic one with a sack over his head from part 2. There's no right or wrong choice. His presence in pop culture history has been celebrated throughout the years in video games, comic books, and even some well-made fan films. While he has most undoubtedly been the face of the franchise, we cannot forget the true mystery of the original killer of Camp Crystal Lake.
Friday the 13th. You may only see it once, but that will be enough.
Friday the 13th was born from the minds of director Shawn S. Cunningham and writer Victor Miller. Cunningham began his filmmaking career working on documentaries in the late 1960s. His first true film would be the X-rated The Art of Marriage in 1970. While only having a crew of 3 people on that movie, it ended up making $100,000 off of a budget that was a little more than just $3,000. The production and mild success of The Art of Marriage caught the attention of another struggling filmmaker, Wes Craven, who at the time had also been working in the adult film industry under a pseudonym. Cunningham hired Craven as a producer and to assemble dailies on his follow-up adult film, Together, starring 70s adult film star Marilyn Chambers. It turned out to be another hit for them, and the production companies Hallmark Releasing and American International Pictures offered the duo a budget of $90,000 to make their next film. However, this time they wanted to make a scary picture. That film turned out to be Wes Craven's directorial debut, The Last House on the Left. Originally, it was written as more of a hardcore adult film like their previous collaboration, but with horror elements. And like their last effort, it was a huge success in the midnight movie circuit.
What people today can't imagine, I mean, they really can't imagine like it was then, was what it was like to see a good exploitation movie in a packed Times Square movie house.
Wes Craven would go on to have another horror hit in the 70s with The Hills Have Eyes, but Cunningham wanted to go in a different direction to capitalize on family films with Manny's Orphans and the Bad News Bears ripoff, Here Come the Tigers. These 2 films first brought the collaboration of writer Victor Miller and Shawn Cunningham. Hoping for the success of his previous efforts, they just didn't connect with audiences or critics. And I'd be lying my ass off if I had told you I've seen them. Cunningham knew he had to come up with a new and fresh idea, and get behind the cameras quick. That same year, he saw the latest horror film that was sweeping the nation, John Carpenter's Halloween. Upon seeing this, his original idea was born.
And Shawn called me up and said, Halloween is making incredible money at the box office, let's rip it off. That is keeping it real.
Okay, so maybe not completely original, but if you're going to rip something off, it may as well be a horror masterpiece. When coming up with the story, Victor Miller tried to think of scenarios that would be adult-free for the teens, resulting in the no-brainer location of a summer camp under the title A Long Night at Camp Blood. But Cunningham had a different title in mind. Before a cohesive plot or even characters were created, he rushed to get the word out on his latest feature by placing a full-page ad in Variety. It featured the title smashing through glass in very bold lettering, claiming that it will be the scariest film ever made. Very bold indeed. With the script, Miller wanted to write your average Pepsi generation type kids. The type of kids any teenager could relate to, and let them run loose in the wild without the supervisions of their parents or any responsible adult, only to have them get knocked off one by one throughout the film by an unseen killer. It wasn't an entirely revolutionary or new take on focusing on the killer's POV, a move first used in Peeping Tom and perfected in Black Christmas, but its use in the film added more to the mystery element to keep the audiences guessing on who the killer is. During the writing process, Victor Miller studied Halloween and noticed a certain pattern to the formula, one that Randy Meeks would call
a very simple formula.
Arguably, Halloween may have laid out the blueprint to the modern slasher, but Miller wanted to lay that blueprint down as the rules that one must follow in order to survive a horror movie.
What those movies bought us is, if you smoke and drink, you're gonna die. If you have sex before marriage, you're gonna die. If you bully other kids, you're gonna die.
For those of you unaware of the original, or if it's been a while, allow me to catch you up to speed in terms of the plot. The film opens up at the infamous Camp Crystal Lake in 1958. After a couple gets bored of the traditional campfire sing-along, the two sneak off for a little alone time. Before second base is rounded, we are treated with a POV of an unseen assailant who murders the poor couple. Before the kill shot actually happens, the opening credits roll on a black screen, with the now iconic score courtesy of Harry Manfredini. We then jump to present day with a young woman named Annie, who is lost and stops by a diner looking for the camp. A truck driver offers her a lift, but before she leaves, she's warned by a local townie, Crazy Ralph, that the camp has
The death curse.
The truck driver elaborates on Ralph's statements and tells Annie that the newly reopened camp is jinxed because of the murders that took place in 1958 and the drowning of a young boy named Jason just a year prior to that. During this time, the film introduces us to the camp counselors, Jack, Bill, Marcy, Alice, Brenda, and Ned, along with the shirtless wood-chopping owner, Steve Christie, as they begin to get things ready for the young campers to arrive. Annie is then dropped off along the way and is soon picked up by an unseen driver. She tries to have some conversation, but it's cut short when the driver speeds past the entrance to the camp. Now frightened, she tucks and rolls out of the Jeep and is chased through the woods where she ultimately gets her throat slit. What makes this setup so memorable, especially for those watching for the first time in 1980, was we spent roughly 20 minutes with this clean-cut girl next door type, who exemplifies all the qualities that you'd see in a final girl. It's a move clearly inspired from Psycho to fool the audience into thinking they are following one woman to the end of the movie, only to have the rug ripped out from under their feet. Going back to the clip which opened this episode, we would see this trend yet again 26 years later with the Scream series. Filming began in September of 1979 at the fully functional Camp Nabibasco, a Boy Scout camp in Hardwick Township, New Jersey. When it came down to casting, most of the teens were virtually unknowns, except for the warehouse punch-dancing champion Kevin Bacon, who had previously had a minor role in Animal House.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
For the lead and final girl role of Alice, producers wanted a name actress and sought after talent such as Smokey and the Bandit's Sally Field, but with the limited budget, they could not afford her. While filming a commercial for Burger King, Adrienne King, no relation, was suggested to audition by a mutual friend of Cunningham's. Prior to this, King had only a few uncredited roles in Saturday Night Fever and Hair, but her audition proved she could act naturally and was the embodiment of the character. The same could be said about the rest of the cast, as they all hit the mark on the typical teen for the time period. One character in particular who stands out is Ned, played by Mark Nelson as the goofy cornball prankster whose character traits are now a must in the slasher genre. Now, with Steve out of the picture, the counselors continue working on the camp. And by that, I mean taking a dip in the lake and soaking in the rays, and maybe partake in the occasional pillow fight while Bill kills the snake. For all of you animal lovers out there, including myself, you may want to veer your eyes in a different direction once you see Bill going after the snake. While many practical effects were placed on the actors, the same couldn't be said for the snake, as this now infamous scene involved a very real snake to be chopped to bits.
On behalf of myself and anyone who's ever harmed a snake, I would like to tell all snakes, poisonous or not, I'm sorry.
Soon after, a police officer shows up and harasses the youngsters while spitting the occasional bigoted remarks towards Ned, who's wearing a headdress. As it turns out, our pal Crazy Ralph is missing, and possibly making him murder suspect number 1 for the first-time viewer. In real life, actor Ron Carroll, who plays the officer, had never been on a motorcycle. So when you go back and watch the scene, keep your eyes on him, as he hilariously tries to handle the bike as he speeds off. Alice then heads to the kitchen to get pots and pans together, when Ralph pops out of the pantry, which causes her to drop everything, and maybe a little chocolate pudding, as he explains he's a messenger of God to warn them that they're all doomed. Instead of scaring the kids away from the camp, it scares Jack and Marcy right into the sack of an empty cabin, unaware that poor Ned has been killed off screen. and is resting above them on the top bunk. While Jack celebrates with a victory joint, he is pierced in the neck by an arrow from underneath the bed, finally jump-starting the slasher elements. While most horror films today rely heavily on CGI for kills, the slasher genre of the 80s treated its practical effects like a work of art. Some films may not be as convincing as others, but with Friday the 13th, the effects were handled exquisitely by makeup maestro Tom Savini. By now, Savini is a household name in the horror community, and is always a pleasure to point out his cameos in movies. But in 1980, this Pittsburgh native was just getting started with just a few credits under his belt. He got his breakthrough courtesy of his fellow Pennsylvania buddy, George Romero, from the criminally underrated Martin, and the zombie masterpiece, Dawn of the Dead. But with Friday the 13th, he expanded on his repertoire by skillfully designing contraptions to make the kills more realistic. You can argue that you don't need gore in a horror film to make it scary, but at the time, it was rarely seen in a mainstream movie. And thanks to Savini's craftsmanship, it became a staple throughout the 80s. With about 40 minutes of solid character development, we then begin to follow each counselor to their ultimate doom, prophesied by the messenger of God himself. Continuing the trend, we still never see the killer, and instead feel their presence, with Manfredini's cues and score. One thing this film really excels at is the music. Today, we rely on loud music cues to tell our brain to scream when jump scares happen. But with Friday the 13th, the creative decision was to have the score as minimal as possible, heightened by a simple whisper.
And I took the consonant sound of the K, K-I from killer, and M-A from mommy. I went up to a microphone and just went K-ah. And we'd ran it through something called an echoplex, which was a gizmo back in the late 70s, early 80s, and it ended up coming
After all the counselors are taken out of the picture, including a returning Steve, we are only left with Alice. She sees a car pull up and assumes it's Steve. She rushes out to help, only to be greeted by a middle-aged woman with a warming smile. She introduces herself as Mrs. Voorhees, a friend of Steve and his family. However, things immediately don't seem right when she begins to tell the story about young Jason drowning in the lake, while the other counselors were off fooling around. Her motherly persona switches right off the bat when she envisions Jason calling for help, revealing not only was Jason her son, but she's also the killer. The final 10 minutes is a frantic chase between the two women, which ends in the beheading of Mrs. Voorhees. Finally, just when you think the movie is over with its hopeful music, we get one last scare as Jason rises from the lake to pull Alice in. So yes, technically Jason is in the first film, but was it really all a dream? The reveal of Pamela Voorhees is certainly one for the books, as most would assume that the killer would be that of a man or a younger person. But when all is said and done, it's a mother who loved her son so dearly that she would stop at nothing to get revenge on those who neglected him. While she took it to the utmost extreme, I'm sure any loving parent could empathize with her. Betsy Palmer's limited on-screen time is so convincing and stellar, yet when she took the job, she only did it to pay off car repairs, and thought the script was a piece of shit.
He sent me the script, I read it, and I said, what a piece of shit.
So there you have it. You walk out with your friends amongst the crowd of adults into the lobby of the theater who are all talking about the movie. Was it the scariest movie ever made that they claimed it to be? Maybe not, but you sure will tell your friends all about it that Monday. When you're home and lying in bed, you check to see if maybe, just maybe, there's someone underneath to give you one more final scare.
On the next episode, grab your winter coat and snowshoes as JoBlo and Arrow in the Head put you up for the night in the finest hotel. Enjoy the seclusive nature, wonderful maze, and the fully unstocked bar. But whatever you do, don't go into room 237 at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining.
Hi, friends. Your humble narrator, Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.